Biotop Word. Hi everyone, my name is Anna Ulrikke Andersen and I am here today with Sasha to talk about the very intriguing topic of architecture and chronic illness and the way our built environment is experienced by people who live with chronic conditions. So do enjoy, and I do hope you find something here that is both interesting and inspiring. Design Biotop Word.
Hi, Anna. I'm really happy to have you on our conversation today. You are a very special person, and I'm very grateful that I got to know you before this conversation we had. Hi.
Hi. Well, thank you. I'm happy to be here as well.
We exchanged so many wonderful and exciting experiences on different perspectives on architecture, design, film, emotions, and chronic illness, of course. Your research is, by my opinion, really important, and it enriched certain fields, especially because you are working with chronic illness in architecture research related to space and how it manifests through chronic illness or living in spaces with chronic illness. And I would love to ask you, how did you end up in this field and what led you to this place of research?
Yeah, I mean, I think this particular project that I entered into the call for future architecture and which is titled An Architecture of Chronic Illness. It's been a project that I've actively worked on for the past 4 years, but I think it is something that I've been thinking about a lot longer. So I do have a background in the history of architecture and the history of art. And for a very long time, I was obsessed with windows. So both my bachelor's thesis and in my master's and eventually my PhD, I looked at windows and especially these ideas related to windows as a separation between inside and outside, but then also the subject and maybe the larger external world. And one of the things that I did become interested in while working on this topic through the people I was working with, supervisors and so on, was feminist theory and including a feminist perspective into the discussion. And with that, I mean, well, there's a nice definition of that, I think, by Tess Coslett, who's defining then feminism as not necessarily only about gender. It's more about allowing these diverse and different voices into the discussion. That I think is very inspirational for me. So I was kind of already in that, on that path, I think. And then I have also a personal history with chronic illness. My recent most diagnosis is rheumatoid arthritis, which is an autoimmune disease. And I think I got that diagnosis a few weeks into my PhD work. So that was very fresh at the time. But even before that, I have had issues since my youth with chronic migraines or also hypothyroidism, which is your thyroid function, also an autoimmune condition, and fibromyalgia, which is kind of related to this whole big mix. So I think, already coming from this field of feminist theory and an interest in the way we respond to the world around us as the window kind of epitomized, I think then once I started experiencing illness and chronic illness and then trying to make sense of whatever was happening within my own body, I think it became a very natural step for me to then start bringing my own perspective and the perspectives of other patients who live with chronic illness then into these architectural discussions. And what I found is that it's not an anomaly to live with chronic conditions. I think it's striking how many of us do live with chronic health conditions, and even more so how many of us will at some point in our life have a chronic condition. So, it's something that many of us experiences, but then maybe aren't discussed as much. So that was where I found a lot of great inspiration from then the field of disability studies and scholars such as Jos Boys, who's an architect who work a lot on these questions related to the role of the disabled body in architectural education, architectural practice, architectural discussions.
I think I asked you in the past, whether you find it pretty fresh. What you're doing seems to be not so common, that you're actually, really going into a research and mixing a multidisciplinary approach with field that you're doing, with actually really participation-based process where people that you're working with on these topics and studying with are actually really having the voice, like Abby Palmer, who is part of your movie, and she is, let's say, having artistic practices herself, and everything is merging together. So do you think that it should be more of this kind of research out there? Do you think that it could be inspiring and could bring a really, really fresh and new perspective into the world of how we build spaces, also through, this multidisciplinary approach?
Yeah, I definitely think so. I think there's a great advantage in letting more voices be heard. It is something, I think, which is becoming more and more of a buzzword in academia or in society in general, that we do hear, the need for getting more voices, more perspectives. Because I think one of the things I've learned from my background in reading feminist theory, and especially Jane Randall, who was my PhD supervisor, who, she's a feminist scholar of architecture. And one of the things that she really stresses is this idea of making sure that every scholar or practitioner think about their own positionality. And to her, these critical spatial practices, which, for example, filmmaking could be, or installation, or public art projects, or writing, poetry, that these are very, very important in terms of bringing that positionality forth. And I think it's also it is really striking, we keep hearing these news stories, or we hear people who say, this isn't something very new. Feminists have started talking about this in the 60s and 70s, and other groups have been also raising attention to the fact that our world is dominated in many ways by a certain group of people. And that also shows in architecture, that the fact that, we build buildings and making sure that a diverse set of perspectives are brought into that design process is just incredibly important. And again, I want to go back to the work of Jos Boys, because I think that's one of her key ideas related to disabilities, is the fact that if you design from the disabled body, allow the many detours and creative strategies that disabled bodies use to navigate the world, if you use that as a starting point for architectural design, you don't only end up with a world physical built environment that is better for people with disabilities, but that it's actually richer for everyone. So I think that's it's a win-win situation. And I also think it's really important to find ways and methods to engage with issues that are really complex and sometimes, contradictory. And I think if you do live with a chronic condition, the way that your view on that view on the reality, the everyday life, how you feel about that diagnosis and how you navigate the world with that diagnosis, it will change over time. And it's very different from person to person. And I think that kind of diversity is just incredibly important to discuss and really make it clear that, there isn't one universal solution to these problems. It's an ongoing and ever-changing and extremely flexible and fluid in many ways experience. And I think you mentioned, Abby Palmer and her book Sanatorium. And I think that book really manages to get the sense of that process, of the way that the body and our minds try to, make sense of what might be happening to us and how our built environment is very much playing a part in that process.
What my question is that most probably you entering different systems, because you studied in UK, you live in Norway and so on. You have faced different experiences with the system, with, let's say, acceptance of many times stigmatized position as being, one of the patients, let's say. Was there any specific obstacle and any specific, let's say, plus in your personal experience with this topic?
No, I think most definitely, I think having that supervisor, Jane, that I worked with during my PhD was extremely important. And I think, well, obviously she does, come from a part of architectural research where individual voices are really encouraged. But I also think, as educators, and now that I'm moving into this next stage of my career where I also will be teaching, I think it's also really important to remember that, the supervisor or the educator are not medical professionals. And I think that was also always really great with Jane that I work with, was that, she could offer me advice and she could offer guidance, but then at the same time, she would refer me to other parts of the system. And I think that's really important in terms of, it's such a big issue that people with chronic illness don't get through the educational system. And I think it's extremely striking, even if, we do want more diversity within both, academia, but the whole profession. And we do want people to go to university. But then so many people, they drop out because the support system isn't really there for them. And I think having supervisors who then could pick up on if someone is maybe struggling and refer them to the right part of the system that could make that process easier for them is really, really important. So I think just in my personal experience, I think that was quite key. And the other thing as well is that, it's important to allow it time, I think, when you're working with yourself alongside these theoretical questions or societal issues, that quite often we do need some time to process things. And there is also a danger to kind of, if you're going through a traumatic experience and the first, solution to that is to intellectualize whatever you're doing, or like to immediately kind of, instead of actually being in the emotion and being in the situation, you immediately start thinking about, oh, I can use that for an article, or that would be an interesting take on, this issue of architectural design. And I think it's quite natural to do that. But it also, if you are, for example, hospitalized, it's fine. Like you should just be hospitalized. You shouldn't be hospitalized and at the same time kind of take that step outside of the situation, try to intellectualize it. So that's the fine balance.
You mean like doing research while you are hospitalized?
But I think the other thing here is that by, for example, being hospitalized and having gone through that experience, then after you do sit with quite unique experiences of architecture, let's say, or you might have gotten to know other patients that can share their experience. And one of the projects that I've been working on for the past year with a colleague of mine called Anna Ulrikke Andersen. She's a journalist and documentary filmmaker. And we became interested in interviewing people with rheumatic illness during COVID about what kind of treatment they usually would get that now was cancelled. And in this project, it received funding from the Norwegian Arts Council, and it's become this online archive as part of the Norwegian Folk Museum. But in this process, we immediately knew who to reach out to. We had the group of people that we know and that we trust, and in the same way, they also trusted us with their stories. So I think it's something about finding common ground. And when that voice is kind of coming from within a group of people with similar experiences, I think it's a completely different situation when it comes to trust. That I think can be, it's so important when you do talk about things that are sensitive and very personal and very intimate sometimes.
What you also mentioned was that when we discussed this in the past, that individuals become specialists of their own conditions. And I still feel that in the world, there is still not enough participation in these processes. So we make decisions for others and that we've never discussed with or never took our stand or position, or I feel that these participatory processes are still very minor when it comes to different groups or engagement of different groups in, I call them design processes. And I just wanted to ask your opinion because you've been working with a lot of individuals, right, through this process. And the common ground was that they all had chronic illnesses, more or less, some sort of arthritis, some sort of rheumatological conditions. So do you think that these insights could be beneficial also to the health professionals and design professionals, if I can call it more widely,
Yeah, I think so. I think one of the most interesting talks I ever gave on this topic was actually at the Harvard Bio Robotics Lab. So this is a lab at Harvard that works with soft robots or different kind of robotics that are biological, or and the team of people working in this lab are people coming from engineering. They are coming from, engineers who make medical equipment, imaging technologies, but also, sociologists and a really wide group of people. And what I presented to them was some work I've then done that looks at the gap that exists of knowledge, but also language between healthcare professionals and patients. And in that mix, you could definitely add also, architects, that there is a gap between the kind of language and the way the architect thinks and speaks, and maybe, what's important to the user. And one of the things that came up during that screening of some films that I done and my presentation, and where I've used a lot of imaging technologies, both ultrasound, MRI, and X-ray, was the fact that them, with their specialist knowledge in medicine or engineering, kept kind of like saying like, oh, it's so fascinating because what you show there, like, it's completely wrong. And by wrong, they meant that, for example, I had an ultrasound equipment and I showed my hand, and then the next cut was like of the kidneys. So to them, it was like, but that's just like so wrong. Like, that's not what a finger looks like. But to a patient, you could see something completely different. And I think there are a lot of stories where the patient would find certain things meaningful or that make sense in their own personal narrative that is wrong if you think of it from a medical perspective. And the way that we respond to and take medication, or the way that we make sense of, if there is a very unpredictable flare-up, I think our minds work in that way, that we do want to find a cause for that flare-up. And the fact that if you bring these groups together and realize like how different the knowledge and the language is in the different groups, and not dismissing, I think, the patient, I think that kind of misunderstandings or misconceptions that the patients come up with can say something extremely important about the experience of being in treatment, the experience of the world, how we find it meaningful. That I think it's key here. And there's one of the scholars that I really enjoyed the work of is a Norwegian anthropologist called Jonas Kure Buer, and he's been looking at people with rheumatic illness and the way the language they use to describe their medication. That's the kind of thing that he researches and really tries to unpack where certain terms or come from and how it's maybe misunderstood, and the way that for many of these bodily experiences, there's not necessarily a language that fits perfectly. And I think these things are just really good to highlight. It can be confusing and it can feel very overwhelming, but I think it's key to include it into a discussion also about architecture.
The movie that you did about methotrexate, the medicine that lots of people with rheumatoid arthritis is actually using, was also showcasing how we never think about medication, or how we don't think about where it's coming from, what was it made of, why they actually developed it in the first place. Like we don't necessarily think about anthropology of things around us, if I can use the anthropology word. And perhaps you could tell a bit more about that project also that you did.
Yeah, I mean, this was one of the first project in this, what currently is a series of films and written essays, and which through Future Architecture will also be an exhibition in Lisbon in October. But one of the first projects I worked on this topic of architecture and chronic illness was the film X for Methotrexate. And I was a fellow at Harvard Film Study Center for a year. This was in 2018. And arriving there, I soon started realizing that there is a very strong history in Boston and at Harvard for medical research, and the fact that methotrexate not only was in many ways invented in Boston in the late 1940s by a professor called Sidney Farber, and it's a chemotherapy, so it was initially used for childhood leukemia. And then throughout the decades, there were some instances where it became clear that it might be helpful for people who has autoimmune conditions, because methotrexate as a chemotherapy, it affects the way the immune system works. But it wasn't until the 80s and a professor called Michael Weinblatt started with some trials that it became accessible to people with rheumatoid arthritis. And Michael Weinblatt, he's a professor at Harvard Medical School, and I had the chance to meet him and really discuss with him, the benefits of methotrexate and this whole story, which to me was very much an architectural history, because I could go seek out these places where the medication had been developed, research and so on. And one of the things I realized was that there are a lot of spaces that only are accessible to certain people, quite often professionals. One of the instances, of course, is the library. We might think that knowledge is available to everyone, everywhere, but the fact is that there is a lot of hurdles to get access to certain libraries, and some people are not maybe familiar with the kind of language being written in those medical journals. So that was, to me, quite interesting. And then obviously the production facilities of pharmaceutical companies in the US, it's just absolutely impossible to get access, especially with a film camera. And they didn't really respond well to my questions about, I kept saying that, I take this medication and I would really love to see where it's made or produced, and just no responses. So I think my meeting with Michael Weinblatt and trying to just go through these sites related to methotrexate, it became this quest to find out more and to learn more. But at the same time, I kept kind of going into these semi-fictional, imaginary scenarios. And I kept talking to people who do use the drug, friends back in Norway, for example, and just really try to unpack have you ever thought about where your medication comes from, or who made it available and why it is available? And that became this really nice speculative conversations about, quite often, elderly white men with white lab coats standing in a laboratory. When the fact is, this medication, it is now produced in factories, but it's being consumed quite often in the home. And that journey between the home and the pharmacy is actually really, really key to many people living with chronic illness. And it is an architecture that is experienced very specifically, in a specific way by people who live with chronic illness. So that also brought up then these other things that I wanted to delve into and focus more on.
Do you believe that, for our own well-being, that it is important that these libraries become more accessible?
Yeah, I think it's a good question. One of the things I read from disability studies that, one of the things that disability studies wants to challenge is the fact that the disabled or ill body should be fixed either through education, medication, or rehabilitation. And I think, education is one of those is one of those elements then that, even if you do, educate people into certain ways to manage their condition or different ways of, balancing their health with diet or so on. I think there's also this, like, that you deflect a bit away from like the core issue by, I think, we are responsible for our own health. We all are. But at the same time, what comes with the chronic condition is a lot that we can't control. And I think the more we kind of highlight that, you should, if you just read this, if you just go on this diet, if you just exercise more, if you do more mindfulness, I have a very difficult relationship with mindfulness, because I think that's one of those, self-help things that we do learn that can deflect, again, attention away from something that might be political. Quite probably it's structural, like the structures in our world is creating these different different issues that affect people's bodies. And I think Abby Palmer, in her book Sanatorium, one of the things she writes about, which I think is so key, is she goes to a rehabilitation facility for her chronic condition in the UK through the NHS. They live in, they all are there, these women in 17 people share the same room, and that's where they sleep and live when they are on rehabilitation. And she felt that quite a lot of the people there, when they were talking about how they were feeling, a lot of the people said that they, I deserve to have this condition because I worked on Tesco my whole life and had to like carry heavy things, or like I haven't been, I didn't get a well-paid job, which I probably should have, or, I had all. So they kept saying that this is something they deserve. And then what she found out, she got funding to go to another rehabilitation facility, a very opulent spa in Budapest. And there, the people she would meet there would say that they felt that they deserved to be there because they happened to have a chronic illness and they had always been so good with money and they were now wealthy. So obviously they deserved well-being. And I think that's quite striking when it comes to how we think about well-being and who deserves what. And these kind of narratives that we create in our own minds. And to me, again, like I think these are spatial. I think, it does matter what kind of rooms you have access to. If you have access to a heated water pool, if you have access to travel once a year to warm climates where your body might respond better to exercise than in a very busy, cold city, for example. So these are very important conversations to have, I think.
Spaces and the energy that we create through these spaces, the smell, the taste, the light, the feeling, the let's say something that will benefit you emotionally is the same important than other qualities of the space, especially with, let's say, overcharging, I think, demanding states of chronic illness, which the space can support you with it or can complicate your life, right? So we both probably feel the same, that the experience that you have around the space, which is the smell, the taste, the light, the general things that perhaps we are not so aware, but when you are living with chronic condition, certain things become extremely important because of the limitations that you're facing. Do you think that there is enough, academic, professional discussion around this? What you have seen, through your academia, research, and professional life?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some really great examples of scholars and practitioners who do aim for these discussions and do aim for a different kind of architecture. And there's always this the big architect, with the extremely large, flashy monuments of buildings. I think, and I hope maybe that, the next generation of architects that is a generation who seems to be quite concerned with politics, concerned with climate change, injustice, and the fact that like that kind of approach to the way we build cities and the way that we build buildings will be celebrated, I think, in a new way. And I think one of the great examples is, that the Turner Prize. This is in the art world in the UK. The Turner Prize, the recent one, had a large number of nominated for this quite prestigious prize in art, had collectives on their list. So it wasn't just these like individuals who kind of worked the system, but you had collectives who had the shared idea of how we can work creatively towards these issues that are facing us. So there are some great examples out there, both from urban planning, from architecture, from architectural theory. So that is definitely exciting. But I think, and obviously the fact that Future Architecture, as a huge European platform, also decided to theme this year landscape of care. I think it's great, and all of the other fellows that I've seen presenting, they have amazing takes on this notion of care and the way that our bodies and built environment kind of entwine, and that's been very interesting for me, and working towards this exhibition that will be opening in Lisbon in October. The topic for this exhibition, it is based on my work on architecture and chronic illness, but it will be titled Chronic Conditions, Body and Building. And the idea is to move into these spaces where architecture is presented through material that's been gathered from various collections, leading collections of architecture throughout Europe, who are all parts of the Future Architecture platform. But then to examine these from the patient perspective. So what I bring with me into these spaces is photographs taken by Norwegian people living with chronic rheumatic illness that's been taken on disposable cameras and then returned to me. And I use these images of the everyday life of patients to have that as a foundation for how we then perceive the other material in the collection has been really interesting. And the fact that many spaces that seems to mean a lot for people is, the part of your living room where you have your favorite chair that's very comfortable, or something that reminds you of exercise is actually like that box with the yoga mat and your small exercise equipment that usually is stacked behind a sofa, or it has its own closet sometimes, or it's below staircase. And that's one of the things I really hope to bring into this exhibition, the fact that, the patient experience of these spaces, and quite often the home is key. So I'm really looking forward to that. The whole exhibition will be trying to unsettle this, one of the structures in our society, at least Western society, that is so key and integral to the way we speak and think, and that is the alphabet. So instead of presenting a complete guide into these issues, which would then be an A to Z in the English language, instead of doing that, I present the A to X. We start with architecture and look at the various ways that architecture and chronic illness kind of meet and intersect, and presents this idea of the patient perspective. But beyond that, we focus on fluids, the fluids in our body and the fluids in architecture, but also large scale. I'm bringing in this wonderful photographs kept by the Gulbenkian Foundation in Portugal that was taken of very, very large scale infrastructures that has to do with water and movement of water through land, and then pairing that up with anatomical drawings of the lymphatic system or blood vessels or kidneys from Royal Academy of Arts. And then also these wonderful drawings, a project from Estonia by Otto Poiraid, who is an Estonian architect who made like this wonderful and really playful slide, 1930s modernistic slide that goes into the waters. And then I also bring with me my own film work to this exhibition. And then the next couple of rooms will look at joinery, both in architecture and the body, and then eventually openings such as windows or doors or, breathing systems and eyes. And then eventually we arrive at X, representing the unknown. And that will be filled with literature related to all of these discussions of body and building. And the idea is then to foster new discussions for the future, rather than for me to present this like complete guide, because it's not complete and we need to keep talking about this. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really a wonderful insight into upcoming exhibition. What is next? What's next?
Oh, what's next? So, I have my my day job is working as a postdoctoral researcher at a project called Disobedient Buildings at the University of Oxford, and that looks at experiences of people who live in blocks of flats in 3 European countries. So that's Norway, UK, and Romania. So we've started that work on the buildings in, I'm responsible for Norway. So that will continue for another year. And that's been really, really exciting. And then I have a grant lined up for after that, which will continue. It's from the Norwegian Arts Council, and that would help me spending more time on this topic of architecture and chronic illness, because I do see this material resulting in a book at some point, and I want to have the time to read, to develop that book proposal more. I have my own first book coming out in 2022 through Bloomsbury Press, and that's titled Following Norberg Schultz, An Architectural History Through the Essay Film. So that's also really exciting to get that project about windows and the essay film and positionality out into the world. So there's a lot of exciting things coming up, and obviously, I think what's been great about future architecture is that it's given me this push to realize that there is a need for this kind of projects that you forget when you have been working on it on your own for such a long time. It's so wonderful to get some feedback from others on it, and then keep working on allowing creative practice a very key part in the way that we research architecture. I think it's key, such as filmmaking that I do, or photography, continuing getting these like the perspective of different people into the debate.
Anna, how do you, like architectural world is pretty tough. How do you keep up with it? What is your self-care moment in the process, of working and living? How do you manage to stay healthy and keeping up with all of these wonderful projects?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a process, and I think it's something you have to learn to manage. Not just people with chronic illness, but I think everyone. And I think when you start out in architecture, there is a culture of doing all-nighters and working very, very hard. And I do think, architecture is a demanding profession. I'm not an architect myself. I'm an architectural historian and filmmaker, which means that I never worked in that way. I never had to do an all-nighter. I never had to work those very long hours in offices that I know other people do. But even so, I mean, there's a wonderful, actually, Australian project called the Parlour Project, which works from a feminist perspective to really focus on these practices of architecture, where there is this ideal of working very, very long, inhumane hours, and the fact that it doesn't necessarily enhance the project either. It's not like there's a clear there's not a clear link between how many hours you work and the result. I think it's up to each and every one of us to get a better sense of like what kind of working conditions make you work to the best of your ability. And for me, for example, like I do take breaks. I think breaks are extremely important. Throughout my PhD, I always use this system that's called 53-17, and it's you use your timer and you work for 53 minutes, and then you have a 17-minute break. And to me, that worked great because I had time to get into what I was doing, and then you have a 17-minute break where you actually get the proper break. I mean, staying physically active, I think it's really important for me as well. And quite often you notice that if you do go for a walk, like your head, keeps like thinking about the issues that you might be facing, and it's a good way of actually getting a break and then feeling a bit refreshed when you return. And then I guess like it's quite important not to compare yourself too much with others. That's also something that I'm learning to do. So I think to me, just like making sure you take breaks, knowing what works for you and your body, and not comparing yourself too much to other people. And then obviously, like if you need help, then seek help. I think that's also very key, either through healthcare professionals or supervisors or others in your vicinity. I think that's quite important. And also, obviously, the more people who talk about these chronic conditions, the more common it becomes. And I think chronic illness isn't, it's not a minority of people who experiences it. I think it's striking like how many people actually live with chronic illness, and in most professions that happens. And some people might find really great ways to navigate that and maybe even slightly hide it, and make sure that no one figures out that, they do have to take longer breaks, or the fact that they do have to take a day off every now and then. And I think it's important not to look at that as necessarily a weakness. I think it's quite human.
Maybe that's the new evolution of where we should go anyway. I think towards individual needs, and that also probably puts the whole working culture under question, which is maybe a good thing, I would say. So Anna, thank you so much for this beautiful conversation with a lot of things to keep on thinking about and researching and bringing out of the stigmatized perspectives, I feel. So thank you so much. And I hope that we meet again and discuss topics in the future again. And good luck with your health and your projects. And
take care. Thank you.
Do we say take care? And take care.
Yeah. Yes, take care.
Yeah. Design Biotop.